Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Pickens, and I'm making this screencast in hopes that my voice can hold out at least for this, because I don't think it would for multiple classes. I'm going over literary devices used by John Lewis in his speech today. And the reason we study literary devices is not only because they show up on the ECA, and they also show up on your SATs, but they also help us become stronger readers and understand and appreciate the text more in depth and appreciate what an author's doing within their text. And these particular devices are used by John Lewis often to emphasize what he's saying and to also make it easier for the audience to follow along with what he's saying, because he's speaking to them. They're not reading a text. So they need some help in following along with what he's saying. So he's going to say things in a particular way to make it easier for them to follow along. And I'm going to kind of relate these back to our soapstones and the speaker and the audience and the occasion, because they all are tied together with how they're using literary devices as well. Okay, so I want you to type along in your notes with me, and I'm going to give you examples of the device and the definition, and you're going to need your literary device chart for English 10, and you can just do a search on your Google document. If you don't have that open already, why don't you pause this video and then start it again when you have everything open. Maybe do a split screen as well. Okay, the first device that we're going to look at is called an allusion. And an allusion is a reference to a famous person, event, book, movie, piece of art, a location, etc., that a speaker makes and assumes his or her audience is familiar with. Okay, and you probably make allusions all the time, and some of the allusions that you make I might not be familiar with because there's stuff that you're into watching or listening to or whatever, and I'm not. And that's kind of why your conversations with your friends are the things that you know that they're familiar with. And whenever you're kind of quoting lines from movies or songs to your friends that you guys kind of find funny, that's an allusion. And I might not always get your jokes because I'm not familiar with the movie. So John Lewis in his speech actually makes a lot of references to things that we're probably less familiar with, but he knew that his audience was familiar with it. And so he just quickly mentioned it. And the way an allusion works is you're kind of just referencing something really briefly, but it's just enough that your audience kind of knows the whole thing of what you're speaking about. However, when we go back and read John Lewis's speech, it's a little confusing because we're not familiar with all those things that he's talking about. He uses a lot of allusions to locations and people within the movement. And so my example here is our brother, James Farmer, along with many others, is also in jail. He just mentions James Farmer, and we later on, as a different audience, don't exactly know who he's talking about. I mean, we know he's in jail, but his audience, Lewis's audience, would have known who he was talking about at the time. That would have been a powerful reference to make. All right, so that's the first device, allusion. Let's move on to our second. And if I'm going too fast, you can just pause and catch up. Okay, the next device is repetition. And this is where words, let me change the font here. Words or phrases are repeated by the author, speaker. This gives a sense of rhythm sometimes, but also gives emphasis to certain ideas. And my example here from John Lewis is one man, one vote is the African cry. It is ours too. It must be ours. And so he's emphasizing this kind of unity with this one and the connection between the individual and the vote. And then he's emphasizing the word ours and ours to kind of emphasize how connected they are and how they're all fighting together for something. And he kind of uses that to create some rhythm too to what he's saying to these short lines, this type of repetition. Okay, the next device I have is one of my favorite devices for speeches. And one of the reasons I like it so much is because it can be really powerful when used in your speeches. So, those of you that make speeches, this is a really powerful one to use. And it also can be really clever in how you use it. And this is a rhetorical question, and you might be familiar with this phrase already. But a rhetorical question is when a speaker asks a question but does not answer it. It also does not expect the audience to shout out an answer. Okay, rather, the speaker uses the question to get the audience to reach the conclusion that the speaker wants them to think. Okay, it's a little manipulative, but not like in a really terrible way. But let's say you have a really strong opinion about something, but you don't want your audience to think that you're really bullying them into thinking a certain way. By asking a rhetorical question, you're kind of softening what you're saying to the audience. But hopefully you're also getting them to kind of think the way that you want them to. So John Lewis uses this a lot in his speech, and it's one of the things that I think like softens the tone of his second speech a lot. And he asks here, but what political leader can stand up and say, my party is a party of principles? And the answer to that question is nobody. But he doesn't want to say nobody's out there. He's softening it by just asking what political party does this. For the party of Kennedy is also the party of Eastland. The party of Javits is also the party of Goldwater. And here he's making a lot of allusions to political leaders that we're probably less familiar with. Okay, so those are allusions. But then he asks some more rhetorical questions here. Where is our party? And he's saying, we don't have a political party that supports us. But instead of being that blunt, he's asking these rhetorical questions. Where is the political party that will make it unnecessary to march on Washington? And he's questioning whether that even exists. But he's using that to get his audience to really think about what the possible implications are of that. Notice he also has some repetition there. There's a lot of devices being used in that phrase and the series of questions. But he's getting his audience to reach a certain conclusion without just coming out and saying it. So it's kind of a really clever device to use in there. Okay, and I think the last device we're going to look at is parallel structure. And parallel structure is probably going to be the hardest one to identify and really understand, but it's important. Parallel structure is a repetition.
Ransom Ferris, please come to the high school office. Ransom Ferris, to the high school office.
All right, so there we have an announcement. Okay, don't go to the office. I knew you were watching this. Okay. Anyways, it's a parallel structure is a repetition of grammar or grammatical structures. Okay, and I know when I give that definition that makes absolutely no sense. All right, so one of the ways that I remember this is you think of math and you have parallel lines. They're running side by side and they're like the same lines. And parallel structure in our sentences is kind of like the same grammar structure. And so let's look at how that actually works, okay? So the example I have here is in the Delta of Mississippi, in Southwest Georgia, in the Black Belt of Alabama, in Harlem, in Chicago, okay? We do have repetition here of just words. That word in and in the is repeated. But basically, we have a repetition of like in and then a place, in and a place, in and a place. And so that place, that noun word, is the grammar that's being repeated. So that's the repetition of grammatical structure. Okay, and we could have other examples of grammatical structure where you have like a preposition and then a noun. Okay, and an example of that is in Abraham Lincoln's speech in the Gettysburg Address. He says something, and I'm doing this right off the top of my head, so I'm probably wrong, but he talks about being a nation of the people, for the people, and by the people. And so he has this repetition of these prepositions. They're different prepositions of, by, to, but he's still repeating the grammatical structure. And then he also has the repetition of the people there as well. But you could say, of the book, in the school, and by the road, and that would be parallel structure as well, because you're repeating this preposition and then a noun. Okay, those are the devices I have for you. What I want you to do is work with your table group to come up with another example from the John Lewis speech and put it in the example I created. I know it's from John Lewis instead, but that way you guys have other examples that you can look to, and you're going through John Lewis's speech a little more carefully. Once you finish that, you can go back to your John Lewis assignments and work on that. Or if you have extra time, you can work on your CNN student news. Or if you have all of that done, then you have free time. Thank you guys for your work today.